What is mass formation, mass hypnosis, and are we currently experiencing it? My name is Nathan Frazier. This is Mindset and Mastery. I've got with me Brett Venat, as always. Brett, how you doing today, man?
Good morning, Nathan. How are you?
I'm fantastic, and I'm a little bit unfamiliar with this term that we're going to be discussing. I've watched a couple of videos on YouTube about this, so just going into the conversation, I want the listeners to know that this is not something I'm super studied on, and I think this is kind of a new term, a new thing in the vernacular, so you brought it to my attention, and I want to give you the opportunity to introduce it to the audience.
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to tell you why I like it. I don't like the idea that this is happening, and I definitely think this is happening. And this Belgian doctor, or I guess he's a social psychologist, his name is Mattias Desmet. He was talking about this over the summer with something that I had never heard of before called the Corona Committee, and it was their 63rd and supposedly final episode. And it's really interesting scene where they're interviewing him via Zoom, and they let him talk in English, even though he's Belgian. And everybody on this panel who's listening to him give his presentation, they speak perfect English as well. And then every 5 minutes or so, I don't know if you saw this video, they stop, and the guy just goes, "All right, I'm going to translate all that to German," and then just talks in German for 5 minutes. It's a hoot. I love the German language. Right. So that was what I watched, but this was first brought to my attention via a Substack just written by under some pseudonym, and it's called Mass Formation and Consequent Totalitarian Behavior in Homo Sapiens. And one of the reasons why I like treatments like this, just to zoom out a little bit, in our program Mindset and Mastery, you and I are using our unique but related experiences writing programs for other human beings, you through marketing and me through being a teacher. Now, one could argue, I would certainly arguing that marketing is more wholesome program writing than what happens certainly in the public schools. And now I would say you could add higher education to that. So we have experience both through our work in podcasting and working with other people, and in our careers, both writing programs and also trying to point out to our audiences how these programs are written, how to unwrite them. And that's a lot of what our Mindset and Mastery program is actually about. So whether we're talking about things that are internal programming or external programming, there can be a lot of frustration, feelings of powerlessness, like, why am I like this? Why is the world like this? So anytime I can find what I think is a kind of novel psychological, neurological, scientific explanation, I'm not saying to blindly follow science, but just to get a new perspective on why frustrating or disempowering things happen to us or around us, I'm always interested in any new take on the subject. So Desmet's work on this concept of mass formation or mass hypnosis was very interesting to me. So just in a quick nutshell, and then we'll get into it. A crisis arrives, allowing people to direct their internal discontent outwardly in a way that is as stressful as it is, or as stressful as it appears on the surface, actually has a soothing and self-satisfying kind of effect. So to understand this mass phenomenon we're currently witnessing without feeling resentment towards people who are experiencing it or dealing with it differently than we are, or the kind of otherizing that often happens in these situations. A lot of this has to do with trying to make sense, what we call sense making is becoming a more and more popular term in a lot of the psychological, neurological media world. So sense making is happening, or people are trying to make sense at a much faster rate than they've ever had to make sense before, just because we're seeing the evolution or the de-evolution of an event here a crisis here where there is just new things to pay attention to every day. So as people need to make meaning or feel like, as we are meaning making beings, they need to feel like they understand what's going on. They will often accept shortcuts, right? But there's something in the mind, I think, like deep in the mind or even in the subconscious that kind of gnaws at you when you do that. Like, hey, dude, you really don't know what you're talking about. So when that happens, people will often look for reinforcements in a group of people who feel the same way or appear to feel the same way, as I think we'll talk about today. So they feel almost like a power in numbers, right? This is like the appeal to popular opinion kind of fallacy, just running in the background of our minds. Like, I must be right because all the people I surround myself with in this echo chamber say the exact same things that I say. So that's both a broad sweep and the concept of mass formation in a nutshell. And I'll answer any follow-up questions or hear your thoughts about it.
Well, I think just in general, people, the way we are as human beings, when we tend to get overwhelmed, when we tend to feel like there's too much, we have a tendency to shut down, kind of like the deer in the headlights thing, and then just wait for someone to save us. So I like the analogy of walking into a house and there's mail on the counter that needs to be sorted. There's dishes that need to be washed. You need to vacuum. You need to fold clothes. You need to, all of these things hitting you all at once. And the easiest thing to do is just sit down and watch Netflix or play Xbox instead, because that is, you're overwhelmed and you're just like, well, I just need the easiest solution. What's the easiest thing I can do with my time right now? And then maybe I'll think about all this stuff later. Superman syndrome also comes to mind when we feel like the odds are so stacked against us. We just want a savior to come in and tell us what to do. In marketing, a lot of times I rely on this. I rely on stacking so many things against the reader, rubbing salt in their wound, agitating their fears, their uncomfortability, everything, just rubbing all kinds of salt in the wound and then giving them a solution. And it feels like that is just something that works with human beings. Just overwhelm them and then offer them an easy solution. Let them know, man, you're hungry, your stomach's rumbling, your kids are whining that they want food, your husband's about to be home from work and you don't have dinner on the table yet, and there's no way you're going to get the pot roast cooked in time. All of these horrible things are mounting up. What if you could just throw something in the microwave, hit a couple of buttons, and dinner was ready for you? So as human beings, when we have you were talking about sense making, nowadays we have so many different opinions. We have 15 different news sources. We have 30 different opinions on social media. We've got this piece of information conflicting with this piece of information. When we are dealing with all of this overwhelm of information nowadays, I think a lot of times we fall back into that. I just want someone to tell me. I just want someone I can trust to tell me what is really going on. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to have to do all the work of trying to figure it out for myself. I just want a push button microwave popcorn solution. And whether or not there's this gnawing feeling in my gut that something is wrong with the way that I'm seeing the world, it's still so much easier than having to go through and sift through all this myself. So I think that has always been part of human nature, but this new term, mass formation, or I think it's also apt to call it, or appropriate to call it, mass hypnosis. He goes a little bit more than that. It's not just the typical, I'm overwhelmed, I'm shutting down, and I'm going to let somebody else take my hand and lead me to the promised land. There's also a sense that there's a sense of hypnosis going on, that we're in a mass hysteria, mass hypnosis phase of evolution right now. And he gives 4 reasons for why he believes that, or 4 components of how he thinks that this has come to being. And I kind of wanted to go through each of those four with you and break them down. Some of them I agree with, some of them I have a little bit of pushback for, but yeah, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, so I just want to say that what he's outlining here is basically prerequisites in individuals that if there is enough of a preponderance of this, that will lead to both group and individual behavior that supports mass formation, or we could just shorthand that as totalitarianism, right? So if the individual is in enough of a distress condition, that group of individuals, if there are enough of these people, and I would say right now there are, will support what used to just be maybe a kind of tiptoe towards totalitarianism and is now more of a steady march, many would argue. So these are the four factors in individuals. Do you want to start with the first one?
Yeah. So this is the one that I actually have a little bit of pushback on. Social isolation, he says, is a key factor for this happening. And the reason why I have a little bit of pushback on this is because I can look back throughout time, just being within my lifetime, 9/11. I remember when 9/11 happened, and I felt like the mass psyche that we're experiencing right now was very similar to when 9/11 happened. I remember after 9/11 happened, people were afraid to go to the mall. People were afraid to go trick-or-treating. There was this engulfing of fear and please tell us what to do, and a steady encroachment on individual liberties. And people were running out and buying. I remember going to the hardware store and there wouldn't be any duct tape or plastic sheets on the shelves because everybody was afraid that terrorists were going to be driving down the street, pumping anthrax into the air. And there was a major... The sense that I get from people right now, it was very prominent right after 9/11, and there was no social isolation after 9/11. We weren't locked up in our houses. We weren't stuck on the internet the way that we are now. And so him having social isolation be a key component, I'm not exactly sure I agree with that. I think that the other three definitely make sense, but this first one, if it should be included, I don't understand why it's the first one.
My only pushback on that would be maybe it wasn't social isolation in the sense of lockdowns when this whole crisis started back in March of 2020. Maybe it wasn't that extreme, but I think a less prepared public back in 2001 was dealing with, for millions of people, a new kind of isolated behavior where their sense making... I think that was like the first time a lot of people started going to the computer screen for, constant updates on what was going on. I remember my internet behavior. I mean, I was in my early 20s when that happened, but I would go days without turning on a computer, even if I used one for the work I was doing at the time. It wasn't like surfing news sites or trying to get any sense of what was going on in the world. After 9/11, that was a daily activity. Another really isolating behavior, even though it feels kind of like a connection or it simulates human connection, is watching the news. I never watched the news. I mean, I was 22. I was right out of college. I was 24. I was right out of college. I was a busy guy. I would never think of news as entertainment, but these Donald Rumsfeld press conferences, George Bush press conferences, joint sessions of Congress. It had this gravity after 9/11. And it probably lasted, if people were old enough to experience, they might also forget that it was a really, really high level of intensity from September 11th until the end of that year. All the anthrax and anthrax in the mail stuff came later. So 9/11 was not a single day. It was a sustained event, not in the sense like COVID was 9/11 every day for months last year. And, that's always a situation that could be purported to be worse if, people in the media choose to do so. So I think that there was a kind of isolation, but it was different, where there were millions of people who maybe don't have families, lived in tall apartment buildings in cities, and literally didn't see another person for weeks or maybe even longer in some cases. So yeah, I get what you're saying, that it's interesting as a prerequisite, but not having that interpersonal communication or substituting interpersonal communication with like CNN updates circa 2001, or an even worse and more extreme version of that in 2020, produce similar effects, even if you are still getting, face to face with people now and then.
Okay. I see where you're coming from as well. Let's move on to the second one. And this is, you were talking about sense making. This one says a lack of sense making in individual lives. So we have social isolation, and then we have a lack of sense making in individual lives. I'd like to give you the chance to kind of expound on that one.
Yeah, we already covered this a bit, so we probably shoot through this one pretty quickly. But most people spend 12 years in a system that asks them in several ways to kind of outsource their sense-making capabilities to other people. And if you want to try to make a little sense on your own here and there, just make sure you refer back to an expert to check your work and get feedback. So that is something that we are very, very accustomed to by, the time we become adults, and certainly through the most formative years of our lives. This is also a system, I'm talking about public schooling, that subtly but persistently inculcates obedience and conformity in people. So when you become obedient and when you become, more conformist, and this is a theme that I'm sure we'll be hitting on for a long time in these conversations, but being obedient is the outsourcing of decision making, right? And in many ways, responsibility. And being a conformist or trying to fit in with a group is the outsourcing of autonomy and individuality. So if a person gets enough practice without knowing that they're practicing it all those years of their lives, their sense-making process or sense-making patterns by the time they become adults are, what do experts say? What do authorities say? What does Tony Fauci or Donald Rumsfeld say about what's happening right now? So that can be a very disempowering experience, especially if the people that you're turning to make sense for you have some kind of incentive, perverse or otherwise, to be the reliable person in that situation, meaning that you have to become dependent on them because you are incapable of understanding or receiving updates on a regular enough schedule to really know what's going on. So you just have to turn back to the TV. You have to turn back to social media or online news or wherever you're getting information, NPR. And I think that the psychic effect of that is, obviously the production of anxiety and internal unrest that people often don't know how to make sense of that either, right? A lot of us, and even those of us who are like well-informed and well-practiced in being good stewards and good operators of our own minds, the last couple of years have been really, really challenging for many of us in that respect. Especially, you think about somebody struggles with like health anxiety, or somebody's been in a kind of prepper mentality where there is almost this like subconscious attraction to apocalyptic events, because it's like, this is what I've been putting money in the bank for. And money in the bank in this case means, food, ammunition, all of these other kinds of things. So the psychic effects of this that people might not be practiced enough in dealing with in a crisis, I think, are also a place where there's a lack of sense making. So it's both external and internal, and the external is kind of reinforcing or exacerbating the internal.
You mentioned anxiety, and that's the third one on here. It says an abundant presence of free-floating anxiety. And I think this one is undeniable. Even myself, who I don't think I ever bought into all of the fear-mongering about this. From day one, I was like, okay, this is probably worse than the regular flu, but it's not going to be nearly as bad as the media and people's reaction to it are going to be. But even I had a sense of anxiety. Even I had, especially, I remember when it first happened, I had to go pick up one of my homies. He got released from prison, and we went to Denver, and we're driving through Denver, and we're the only car on the highway.
Mm.
And that was so weird. Like Denver traffic is always bumper to bumper. It takes an hour to get 4 blocks. And we're driving. This was right after the lock. It was the week that they did the 2 weeks to slow the spread. And we were the only people on the highway. And it felt like a post-apocalyptic scenario. It felt like Walking Dead or something. And as much as I was like, okay, don't let the fear and anxiety uh, overwhelm you, I still felt anxious. And throughout this whole thing, I think that I've done a better job than almost anybody I know as far as keeping my anxiety in check. But my business suffered. I can definitely look back at 2020 and see that my business suffered because I let some of this get to me more than I should have. I think that's the worst impact it had on me was in my business. But for the people out there, though, this free floating anxiety, I see it everywhere, and I still see it with a lot of people. It seems like more and more people are kind of snapping out of it, but I still see this free floating anxiety kind of going around. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, when it's free floating and it's anxiety and it's undefined, I think that like takes us to number 4, right? Which is something to point it at, right? So number 4 is similar, and then he puts in parentheses, consequent abundance of free floating psychological discontent. So the anxiety is internal, the anxiety is undefined. Number 4 provides in again, we're meaning making creatures, a target for why we feel this way, right? And once we identify the thing to point all of that negative or uncomfortable energy at, that's where I think you start to see more of the tribalizing, like who has the right set of ideas about this thing, who has made sense in the same ways that I've made sense, and really clutching on to like, this is the sense I've made. There's a ton of insecurity because whatever the event is, there's all kinds of things that the average person's probably not going to understand about it. Like this a virus is a perfect storm because there are so many places, there's such enormous gaps in the average person's knowledge and understanding of this. And this is something you and I have talked about before, but what makes a great conspiracy theory? Like, why is the Apollo hoax conspiracy theory so persistent? Or why is there why was there, I guess it's not the case anymore, why was there so much energy and attention and people in the 9/11 truth movement? Because nobody could understand how those things happened. If you think about 9/11, 2001, there had never probably been a more complicated day in human history. I mean, maybe there's some examples during like World War I or World War II where that many things happened in a day involving that many people, that many novel events. It was a terribly difficult kind of event to make sense of. This is a persistent, developing kind of situation with the current crisis. So people are threatened if there's like diversity of opinion and people who've have some other sense made about it. That person is a danger because they are basically a threat to that person's stability and their entire reality. So at number 4 here, psychological discontent often gets pointed outward at others. And it's just to think too about the way a lot of our neurology works with anxiety. Our brain never let go of any of its dumber parts as it evolved. So now most of the important work we do is with the prefrontal cortex, like the reasoning part of our brain. But way further back, we have this emotional center, like our limbic system and then our amygdala, that is not good at making sense at all and just sends like fight or flight responses into the prefrontal cortex. And then I think that a sense making has to kind of happen there, where it goes, oh, why do I feel this way? It doesn't make any sense that I feel this way. So we look for something to point it at. Otherwise, like having uncomfortable feelings that we can't explain, but having the rational capacity in the front of our head to understand what that is, but not be able to do it, is a really unsettling kind of phenomenon for anyone who's ever had like a panic attack or generalized anxiety disorder. So like, at that point, there's a new crisis and it's internal, and sense has to be made even faster, which is why we keep seeing the growing discontent and otherizing, tribalizing, us versus them kind of stuff happening. I think that's a huge contributing factor to it.
So I'm going to take it back one step, and I'm going to go through each of these real quick and then get your take on this. So number one, social isolation. Everybody's locked down. Everybody's afraid to go visit their loved ones. Everyone's afraid to be within breath shot of somebody else. So social isolation, check. Lack of sense making. This is brand new. We've never experienced this virus. It's a novel virus. And so most of us don't understand what's going on, what we should do, how we should handle it, how our actions are going to impact things. So check. Lack of sense making, check. Abundant presence of free-floating anxiety. Everybody's freaking out. We don't know when we're going to be able to go to work. We don't know when we're going to be able to visit our loved ones. We don't know what the future holds. Is this thing going to last 2 weeks like they're saying? Is it going to last years like other people are saying? Is it just a flu, bro, like other people are saying? A lot of anxiety. It's free-floating. Check. Abundance of free-floating psychological discontent. I think rather than tribalism, originally this was directed at the virus itself. Originally it was, hey, let's all unite against this virus. And that was, I think, the original goal was to get everybody united against the virus. And then because of how human beings are in general, the tribalism broke in, the anti-mask protests, the anti-lockdown protests from one side started causing a rift. But at first, for the first month at least, even my conservative friends were very much on board with, we need to fight this virus. We need to fight against, we've all got this common enemy. It quickly broke apart much faster than like the war on terror broke apart. But I think initially the goal was for this last one was the free-floating psychological discontent was supposed to be directed at the virus itself, not at each other. But then we started becoming tribalized, and they said, okay, well, let's just use this as another divide and conquer tactic, which all of these things you mentioned lead to once we're in this state where we're socially isolated, we don't understand what's going on, we're looking for the experts to tell us what to do, we're constantly anxious, we're desperate for a solution, and we've got this this virus that we're all angry at. It's destroying our lives, and we just want somebody to help us fight it. And we'll do anything we're told in order to fight against this enemy. And then arises a charismatic leader in the form of Dr. Anthony Fauci. And and that's where we find ourselves now, almost 2 years into 2 weeks to slow the spread. 2 years into lockdowns and mask mandates and now vaccine mandates. And if you question me, you're questioning the science. And 2 years into this, and the question that I have was, or is, this mass hypnosis, does it indicate a hypnotist? Does it indicate that the media knew what they were doing, or the people behind the media knew what they were doing? The experts, at least at some level, at the very tip top, know what they're doing, know that they're using this checklist that has been used over and over again to bring about tyrannical, charismatic leaders. In your opinion, do you think that all of this just accidentally fell into place coincidentally and perfectly to lead to where we're at? Or do you think that there was some conscious decision-making behind how the story would be presented, how these things would be rolled out in order to get us to this point of mass formation, mass hypnosis?
Yeah, at this point, I would say that it's the latter. But one of the things that sort of cartoonifies a behind the scenes conspiring of that is like how many people would actually need to be involved. And it's like, I mentioned this a couple of times in our series, Emotional Manipulators for Hire, where we were talking about how the media uses these forms of manipulation. And one of the best manipulators is a true believer, right? Like somebody who you can't back them into a corner where they're like, I'm lying. I was just reading that off a teleprompter. They're holding a gun to my head right outside of the frame, and you can't see it at home. Like you're never going to get that. And the example that I used was Noam Chomsky, who, by the way, has gone off the rails in a major. He's like 90, and I almost think it's elder abuse to be putting him in front of the camera at this point. But he was saying something like unvaccinated people should be isolated from society, and I was like, wow. Anyway, back in the day, he was great, at least as far as his deconstruction of mainstream and corporate media. And he's having this contentious interview about manufacturing consent, this concept that comes up a lot in what we're talking about right now. And the reporter, challenges him and says, oh, so you're saying that I'm lying, that I'm part of like a conspiracy to deceive people? And he says, no, I don't think you're part of that at all. I think you're here because you believe what you're saying. And if you started to question what you were saying, if you started to question the song sheet or singing, a different song entirely, you'd be replaced with somebody who will sing from that song sheet. This is a very, very competitive industry. Those are very high prestige jobs, what we see in mainstream media. And obviously the mainstream media in the last 20 years has expanded enormously beyond, 3 television networks and three standard broadcast television networks and 3 or 4 cable networks. It is huge. So it's a very, very competitive. And there are lots of true believers. And even if there are doubts, like in a religion where you have your moments of doubt about the existence or God or whatever, there is plenty of stories you can tell yourself, plenty of ways that you can reinforce that for yourself. So I think, yes, there are certainly people who are positioned to capitalize from this. I think there is still at this point, as a minor generator of anxiety for me, I don't know why this is happening now. But at this point, this is not about a virus. This is not about a virus. You can go to my website, everybody, if you want, schoolsucksproject.com, and just search "This is not about a virus," and you can see some content we created about that declaration. But yes, something else is going on here. Why now? And who are all the who's of that why? I don't know. And I don't think it's particularly useful. I think the better exercise is understanding from this neurological, psychological, mass psychological perspective why it's happening, the effect that it's happening. And again, that's your sphere of control versus not your sphere of control, like we talked about in episode 1. If you spend all your time out there, that's just going to lead to increasing feelings of smallness, disempowerment, and I ask people not to do that. I ask people to model good sense making for as many people as you can. Make sense making. I mean, if that would be my one takeaway from this whole topic, it would be make sense making more accessible. There is no microwave popcorn of sense making, and maybe sense making, like true sense making, can't be microwave popcorn. Maybe you got to get out a pot, right? Maybe you have to invest 15 minutes instead of 3 to get something that's non-toxic. And I'm sorry, microwave popcorn people, that stuff is toxic. But maybe you actually have to endeavor to put a little work into this. But there's still ways for it to be accessible, more accessible than it is. What's accessible right now? Social media, late night comedy, CNN, MSNBC. That's Tucker Carlson even on the other side. And you kind of wonder what the whole role of an agitator is in this situation. So that's what's accessible. That's what's easy. And it's not just easy to get, like to flip on the TV or open your phone or your computer, but it's also like, here's the explanation, dude. Mm-hmm. It's this simple. And you see the reduction of complicated, I forget what I was watching, but I almost pushed my computer out the window when I saw how complicated a lot of the stuff around Joe Rogan's meds when he got sick, the reduction of exploration that was done by the mainstream was sickening. It was sickening. Now, it's all easily explained. Everybody's seen that super clip of brought to you by a certain pharmaceutical company, or what do they call that? A mashup. That mashup of all these things are brought to you by the same people. It makes sense pretty easily if you wanted to, but if you're that lost in the hypnosis, those things don't have any effect. These things are very, very hard to explain to people. So confusion making is very accessible today, covered by this veneer of like, here's the only rational, responsible way you can think about something. Well, you just get more and more confused, and you have to keep coming back to, Morning Edition on NPR to get your sense made that day. So, geez, long-winded answer to what was not a simple question. That was not a simple question, but I don't know. I don't. People are certainly lined up to capitalize, and what's more important is that these kinds of technocratic designs have existed for 70 years at least, right? So wanting to standardize, systematize, make the population more predictable, and fall in lines in service of some kind of utopia generated from the minds of people who've never really lived in the real world. Because they're either part of the academic ivory tower or the tech ivory tower. They probably look at the average person, as has always been the case with intellectual elites, with a certain amount of disdain and fear, right? I mean, not only are these people stupid and crazy, but some of them have guns, that kind of a thing. So there is an elite, a small group of people that is also very echo chambered in their thinking, surrounded outside of that echo chamber by yes men and people like, interviewers on CNN who want to make them feel like they're very, very important. This situation seems like it reinforces their importance. So therefore, even if they don't realize it for themselves, they have a subconscious desire to perpetuate it, so they can maintain that sense of importance. So it's a very, very complex nexus of things that are going on right now. But yes, at the center, there are people who are like, here is our chance to bring about our utopia. Mm-hmm. Getting rid of all these silly old ideas of, democracy or even like local or self-governance that America was supposedly based on.
So you brought up the true believers, I think is the term that you used. And you sent me an article about this. And one of the things that they were talking about is the breakup of the population, about when we find ourselves in a mass formation or a mass hypnosis state. Only about 30% are actually under the spell. Only about 30% are true believers. And then another 40% maybe are just afraid to speak up. They're afraid to say that they disagree because of maybe the consequences, the social ostracization. How do I say that word?
Oh, you put me on the spot. Let's try ostracization. Ostracization, yeah. I think.
There you go. Being socially ostracized, 40% are just not willing to be the nail that stands out and risks getting hammered down. And so between that 30% of true believers and the 40% who are afraid to speak up, we've got about 70% of the population that just goes along with whatever the suggestion is. The stay at home, save lives, wear a mask, save lives, get vaccinated, save lives. 30% blindly agree with it. 40% disagree, but they're afraid to say anything. And then we've got another 30% that will openly say, hey, I don't agree with this. They'll go to the protests. They'll go on Facebook and say, this is all just a flu, bro. I think also inside of, this has been my experience inside of the medical industry. I have friends that work as nurses and doctors. I have family members that work inside the medical industry. It seems very much the same there too. It seemed like about 30% of the medical industry, the experts, actually bought into. They were the true believers. They were like, this is the worst thing ever. It's going to kill everybody. We have to take all these measures. And then we had about 40% that were like, I'm not exactly sure. This seems a little bit fishy. It's not what I'm walking into work. It doesn't match what the news is saying, but I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to be called a crazy conspiracy theorist. So I'm just not going to say anything unless somebody I trust asks me, and I can trust that they're not going to ridicule me for speaking my mind. And then we have seen what we've seen recently, where 30% of, or up to 40% of doctors and nurses at different hospitals are just walking out because they refuse the mandate.
Yep.
And we're watching a lot of medical experts, and I would say it's about 30%, maybe a little bit less, that are just saying, hey, you guys have been fed a narrative, and while this is dangerous, it doesn't justify me taking this experimental medical procedure in order to keep my job. So I'm going to lose my job over this. And I wanted to touch on something, two terms that I recently came across. First of all, preference falsification and pluralistic ignorance. And both of them are kind of the idea of you're sitting in a room and there's 100 of you, and somebody says something blatantly false. One of the speakers at the front of the room says something blatantly false, and it looks like you're sitting there thinking to yourself, this is crazy. Why isn't anybody saying anything? But you look around and nobody's saying anything, so you don't say anything either because you assume, well, everybody must agree with it. But then at least half of the room is doing the same thing as you. They're all looking around being like, this is crazy. Why isn't anybody saying anything? Well, I guess everybody believes it. And I feel like there's some of that has been going on. And I also feel like the media uses that against us. I think that I've noticed, like, polls, the way that they report on polls, a lot of times I think it's just to make you think that you're in the minority. Oh, well, 70% of people support this wildly unpopular candidate that you can't stand. It must be that you're crazy. Everybody else loves this person, so you must just be wrong. And the truth is that most people hate the person, but because the poll says everybody loves the person, then they're like, well, I guess I might as well go vote for the person because everybody else is going to vote for the person. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on how much of these preference falsification and pluralistic ignorance, your thoughts on the two of them, and then how much do you think that's playing a role in what we're watching happen right now?
Well, I mean, something that we're acculturated to our entire lives, and again, schooling is a huge part of this. Like the classic example of that first one is, does anybody have any questions? And you look around the room and you say, am I going to be the only idiot with a question? And maybe there's 10 or 12 people thinking that. But because of that, conformist behavior, again, the Ash experiments, I certainly have talked about that on School Sucks. But the Solomon Ash conducted these experiments, I think in maybe the 50s or the 60s, or maybe there were like several runs of this. But he would put a person at a table with a group of other people who were all in on the experiment. And he would show them lines, and he would say, let's get group consensus on the longest line. And the Confederates...
Just to clarify, the one person that was being experimented on thought that all of the other people around the table were also in his or her same shoes.
Yeah. So I think the term they use is Confederates, meaning that you're in on it. So the other people would just... At some point, it was so obvious how off the line they chose was for being the longest line. And more often than not, in fact, at an alarming rate, the person who was being experimented on would conform to the group because you start to feel like you're crazy if you don't. So we see that effort being made today. By the way, at least in my city, today is an election day. Now, everywhere it's an election day, first Tuesday in November. So it's kind of like, are you really making a choice on election day? Certainly like in a presidential election, whether you're red or blue, I don't really think that's important. What's important is, do you show up to sign off on the system, right? So again, to go to Desmet's breakdown of these percentages, 30% will be completely hypnotized and up to 40% will say nothing. Again, as far as the people who are, I would say, in positions of power or doing perception management or outright, forceful manipulation in this case, they don't care what these groups of people are writing in their journals. They only care, or do you shut up or do you not shut up? And In this case, the people who don't shut up are now a very, very small minority that is easy to demonize and pathologize because, hey, man, 75% of people are shutting up. 75% of people are signing off, at least as far as how they show up publicly, right? They're signing off on the system. They're signing off on the march forward that we're doing here, even if 40% disagree. So I think one of the projects of perception management, and this is a little, do you like to get conspiratorial ever, Nathan?
I do.
All right. So this is a little conspiratorial, but like at the very beginning of this year, there was an event in Washington, D.C. where a bunch of people were kind of, unwittingly marched out into a spotlight. And then the media said, this is what happens to bad people. And there's no room for like investigation of what that actual event was all about. There's just like, these are bad people. This is what they look like. This is what they do. This is what will happen to them. And it was a very, very small group of bad people, but there might be a lot of them out there. So they are put into the spotlight of here's what happens when you're bad. While a chilling effect is produced on the 40% going, what the hell is going on here? What's actually happening here? The private journal thoughts that they might write. It only matters if it shows up publicly. So make an example of what looks like a tiny minority, at least as far as the people who act out, and then that will maintain the illusion of 75% consent, acceptance, support of whatever is happening. So again, same as election day. 60-70% of people go and vote. They vote for 2 or 3 different parties in a lot of places. It doesn't matter. 70% of people went and said, I support the system. I support the status. I support how things are, or I support the continued progression of how things are going, because I'll keep doing the same behavior that I've always done that got us here as a citizen, which is go to check boxes next to the name of strangers who don't care about me.
All right. You just went a little bit too radical for me, Brett Venat.
Can I just say a little tip too? Like when we're having a conversation that I think is going to be potentially agitating, I always choose my Mr. Rogers coffee cup. And it is the entire cup is surrounded by Mr. Rogers quotes that I just try to peek at when I feel like my pulse going up or my voice being raised. I'll just I like you just the way you are. I like you just the way you are. There it is right there. So,
okay. So I'm gonna wrap this conversation up by hopefully having a little bit of optimism towards the end.
Absolutely.
So we just had this election last year where Joe Biden was the most popular candidate of all time, got more votes than any other candidate in history. And what a shining beacon of democracy that whole thing was. And people asked questions and got ridiculed for asking questions. And especially with the incident that you were just talking about that happened in January, made it really easy to silence anybody who was asking questions. Oh, you're one of those people. You're asking questions about, you don't believe, you're not one of the 30% of true believers or the 40% of people who are afraid to speak up. You're one of those people.
It's the best way to deal with the individual anxiety about sense making being made in too rapid, like shortcut a fashion, is you're insecure about the conclusions that you've made deep down, but people who've made different conclusions, or people who are acting as if they've accepted different conclusions or have different feelings or thoughts about something, are crazy criminals. You know what? They're terrorists.
Okay.
So that's like that's a very comforting. That is a nice weighted blanket of sense making right there. Yeah.
Okay. So the flip side is, though, while the media has that going for them, while they have the fact that 30% are true believers, 40% are afraid to speak up, it feels like the spell is breaking. It feels like cracks are forming in the dam, and a couple of instances of this recently. I think Ice Cube just walked out on a $9 million movie deal because he was just refused to get the vaccine. And I wouldn't say he's a leftist, but he definitely leans left. There's been sports basketball players that are just like, you know what, I'm giving up my career. I'm not going to do this vocally. There's pop stars now. I think Nicki Minaj, maybe. I can't remember who it was. I think it was Nicki Minaj that was publicly asking questions. We see pop stars leaving the recording studio wearing shirts that say think while it's still legal. A lot of these people that have traditionally been used to reinforce the mainstream media narrative are starting to push back against it. And right now, if you go to iTunes, 4 out of the top 10 songs in iTunes are all titled Let's Go Brandon. And Let's Go Brandon is a meme that started from people saying F Joe Biden, and then it got the media tried to skew that and say that they were saying Let's Go Brandon. So now people have started cheering Let's Go Brandon. It's out of control. Entire stadiums, football stadiums, baseball stadiums, NASCAR stadiums, entire stadiums full of people yelling out Let's Go Brandon in defiance against what's going on right now. 2 airlines, Southwest Airlines last week or the week before, had a huge situation where they had to shut down thousands of flights. American Airlines over the weekend shut down an additional 1,000 flights due to bad weather, as is what they're saying. But a lot of people are saying it's because and there was pictures of pilots hanging Gadsden flags outside of the windows of the cockpits of their planes. There's pictures of police officers hanging Gadsden flags saying we will not comply. It feels like the hypnosis is finally starting to break, and I don't know how much longer the narrative can continue going on. But back to the last episode we did, or back to a recent episode of Hack the Matrix that I did, force versus flow. When you use force to accomplish something, when you use force to get your political goals across, when you use manipulation, you have to continue using an escalating force and escalating the manipulation in order to maintain what you won. And it can only go on for so long before it crumbles. And every despotic, totalitarian regime throughout history has risen and fallen because it doesn't mesh with how we are as human beings. It can't work in the long run. And I feel like that's kind of where we're at the point now with all of this. We're seeing global protests against vaccine mandates. We're seeing more and more resistance, even in some of the most compliant places. The narrative is falling apart when we see places where the most vaccinated populations are also having the most hospitalizations right now. Their story is falling apart, and it seems like more and more people are breaking free of the mass formation. And I think that it's more than likely, at least here in America, it's more than likely that people are going to snap out of it before the people that have been using this to get their goals accomplished are able to actually reach their end game. And I think that when people look back on this and the fog of war has cleared a little bit, there's going to be a lot of people that lose a lot of trust in the experts and a lot of trust in the system. And so I think that all in all, this is going to do a lot to reveal the hands. I know personally in my own life, people who have made fun of me for my predictions about things for decades now are coming back to me and being like, yo, you called this 10 years ago. You told me that this was all happening. And how did you know it? And they're starting to ask questions now. This whole thing has made more skeptics than any amount of activism ever has. And so just to close this, I'm going to say I'm optimistic about where we're going. Even though it seems dark right now, I feel like this is, and even though it feels like most people are still sleepwalking, I feel like this has done a lot to wake up a large percentage of the population.
Well, I disagree. I'm optimistic about where I'm going. I'm optimistic about where you're going, and a lot of the people that we know are going. But I'm not holding out too much hope for everybody else out there. But again, like optimism for what's inside your sphere of control versus a healthy cynicism for what is outside of that, I think is the right approach here. And just to keep putting one foot in front of the other each day of your life, living like, the world is going to be like, with some level of preparation, understanding for what might happen, but like to not retreat, right? To not retreat from the world, to not retreat from your ambitions. Maybe a lot of us experienced some moments of that last year. I think you mentioned that, and I certainly could relate to that when you said that. But as far as the system is concerned, which includes, the media, the corporate structure, the government, and the sort of supra governmental players that we've all heard a lot about over the last year, like the people who do have these more utopian designs on not just the United States but the entire world. If this is truly not about a virus, when this is worn out, a new thing could certainly emerge to take its place. And because of the way that this has been managed, people always attribute this to the virus itself, but the response to it has created certainly a high probability of numerous other problems developing, a lot of them economic, but also like, infrastructure, cyber attacks is something that we hear. I'm really holding out that it will be, or kind of, if it has to be something, like let's do extraterrestrials, let's have it be as entertaining as it can possibly be. But if this needs to happen for some reason now, and people have decided, and the true believers are in the media are on board with it, and the subservient political and bureaucratic class is on board with it, or at least not courageous enough to effectively speak out against it, and this march continues forward, something else can certainly be put in the place of this thing. But any mass formation requires individuals. And I have really always thought just to, again, operate inside your sphere of control, where you can generate, you can earn a kind of power and then spread as a kind of influence to other people. Model good sense making, right? So whether that's make sense making more accessible, like I said before, and there's three great lessons in this idea of reflection from a book I've mentioned to you a few times, maybe even in this conversation at the very beginning, Mindsight by Dan Siegel, which was one of the first like scientific neurological approaches that I ever knew of anyway, to understand internal crisis and to work towards personal development, was like to understand what is actually going on inside your skull and throughout your body as your brain kind of spreads through your body in some interesting ways. And helping people expand their own reflective capacity, their capacity for self-reflection and reflection about what happens around them. He has these 3 O's: openness to whatever comes to our awareness. So we're willing to accept, right? We're living consciously and willing to accept what comes to our awareness is like, hey, that's interesting, I'll look at that, and not becoming like a rigid wall or super defensive about ideas that are not yours. Like, hey, things are complicated. It is hard to make sense. Accept that you might not have done it perfectly, and just don't be super resistant or afraid of other opinions or interpretations. The second O is observation. Which has a lot to do with self-perception, but also like the feedback that you're getting from other people, especially in a crisis that is individually emotional or emotional on a mass scale, like what we've seen here. And the final one is, objectivity, right? Remembering that our thoughts and our feelings, or our conclusions about something, are not the totality of our identity. And this is one of the reasons why tribalizing and otherizing and that resentment towards groups of people, groups made up of individuals who might be struggling through something, is that they are kind of, we do this mental shortcut where we make their conclusion, as it shows up socially or politically, the totality of their entire identity. So we can dismiss them and simplify our sense making. So openness to what comes our way, observation and self-perception, and objectivity, and this understanding that our thoughts and feelings are not the totality of identity. And that is also true with other people. That, staying open and staying to whatever degree you can, compassionate with yourself and with others, I think is a really, really good thing to model. Because if you look like you're enjoying life and you're not flipping out about everything that happens, even if somebody doesn't go, hey, tell me more about what you're doing, you're at least becoming a person of interest. You're at least showing something that is attractive to other people. How can I get more of that serenity and actual sense making in my life? Right. But it's a delicate touch. And the more the crisis kind of, continues, the more delicate touch is needed. But mass formations are composed of individuals. We are individuals. We cannot deal with a mass in any way. So we have to work with people on an individual level. And I think there's enough people to do that. I think there's enough people who are aware or have enough of a level of awareness about what's happening right now and in themselves where they could, I'll take on the responsibility of these 5 people.
I just want to go back to the 30, 40, 30% thing, the 30% true believers, the 40% who are afraid to speak up, and then the 30% who are not afraid to speak up. The more vocal that latter 30% is, the more sway they'll have over that 40% in the middle, and the more likely, a lot of times courage is contagious. And when you show courage, the people who are in that 40% who don't agree, but they're afraid to say anything, if they see a bunch of people standing up and saying, hey, this isn't right, it'll give some of them the courage. So keep that in mind as well.
Well, yeah, that's actually, there's another way that this is like an election. I'll make this real quick because I know we got to get out of here. But, in any election, if it's just like red versus blue, you have a certain percentage of people who are always going to go blue and a certain percentage of people who are always going to go red, right? And the battle is for the minds of the middle. So everybody is trying to speak to that middle, like, hey, middle, look at how bad red is, or look at how bad blue is. Come with us, that kind of a thing. So I think that getting, yes, maybe the 30% that always goes along is the kind of, whatever, mainstream, corporate legacy press, believe everything you see, trust the experts, follow the science crowd. And maybe you have the 20 or 30% that is always going to be like, what the heck's going on? The Alex Jones crowd, just to put some faces to this thing, right? But they're both talking to the people in the middle. And I think the more those people in the middle, and this is the really optimistic thing, start to believe more in their own agency, right? You don't have to come with us or come with them, but see the modeling, whether it's, in alternative media personalities they like, or just people that they're encountering in their own lives who are going, hey, I have some questions about this. It's like we've been told our whole lives, don't talk about politics or religion in polite company. So people don't talk about these things and they just keep going. They just keep marching forward because we're not supposed to talk about that. We're not supposed to try and improve our sense making abilities together. We're just supposed to, trust experts like we learned. So I think the more people in the middle who are doing that and starting to have the courage to speak out as the world around them seems to be necessitating it more and more, that's something that I'm actually really hopeful about. And all of the things that you mentioned now around current news events or mandates and all that seems to be suggesting that people are at least getting a practice run of doing that. So yes, maybe the hostile alien apocalypse comes upon us in 2022, but I really, really just hope that people remember 2020 and all they could have learned from that situation in kind of going forward. It's why in the last year and a half, I've said the phrase 9/11 like 4 million times, because look at all the lessons that could have been learned there, between 2001 and say, 2008, or until 9/11 was complete and the war on terror was completely worn out. It took 12 years, 13 years that they could run with that. So COVID is much more of it's much larger than that. So it has the potential to be with us for a while in one form or another, while the perception managers go, remember how we told you, this is just like you, the vaccine thing versus the mask thing. One was kind of a trial run of the other, right? Break people into groups, make enemies, go to the experts. So, boy, I just need to hold my coffee cup for a minute. Really went on a tear there, Nathan. But I'll wrap that up for today. I am hopeful about this as well because people will have a chance to learn from this if they want it. So that group in the middle is very exciting to me right now.
All right. So if you enjoyed this conversation, make sure that you're subscribed. We are on YouTube. We'll also be on your favorite podcasting app, wherever you found this conversation. If you enjoyed it, make sure that you're subscribed to it. My name's Nathan Frazier. I've got Brett Venat with me, as always. And until next time, we will catch you later.
Thanks.